When the people of Israel actually lived in Israel and the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, the people knew who they were and what to do. And they went to the temple regularly to mark the Sabbath and to sing there the songs of God. And all seemed well. And for 600 years, they did just this, and all seemed well. And then, 600 years before the birth of Jesus, the Babylonian armies from what is currently modern-day Iraq descended into Jerusalem, and they sacked the city. They destroyed the temple, leveled it, burned it. And they carried the people away to live in exile in Babylon. And all of a sudden, nobody knew quite what they were supposed to do with themselves. How, they asked, can we sing the songs of God in a strange land? When there is no temple, when there is no place for us. But God revealed yet again that God is a purposeful force. That God had a deep purpose for them. And it was while they were in exile that many of the great Hebrew Bible texts were written down. If the people couldn't be in the house of God on the Temple Mount, they could at least be with the stories of God's people. And they learned new songs and sang them. And they gathered in smaller groups that came to be called synagogues with teachers who came to be called rabbis. And they discovered anew the purposes of God in exile. And then when at last, after about 90 years, a new geopolitical force arose from Persia, and the Persians came and conquered the Babylonians and discovered this pocket of Jews living in this place, it meant nothing to the Persians. And they said, if you want to go home, go home. So they did. And they went home to this place that they had sung about and hoped to see, only to find that they had had more in exile than was left in Jerusalem. The temple was still in ruins. The people were still living in abject poverty. But God is a God of purposefulness, and called forth the prophet we know as Isaiah, the third Isaiah, who stood and said, behold, a day is coming when I am about to create a new heavens and a new earth. New times are coming to you, folks, in this place. I have purposes for you. And the people learned to sing that song too. And they rebuilt the temple, and they restored patterns of justice in their community that endured for hundreds of years further. God is a God of deep purposefulness. Now, I have a story to tell about what I perceive deep purposefulness to be happening among us. It stretches back a long time, even before I arrived, but every one of you is involved. About 20 years ago is when I'm going to tell the story. Hancock was in need of a new minister. They had 3 at the time, and they needed a 3rd minister to work for justice and to work with young people. And they began to ask, well, who can we get? Who should we get? And they looked, and they discovered they had a bright young person on their staff already, a student minister named Dan Smith. And they said, how on earth are we going to do any better than Dan? And realized you couldn't. Still true today, probably. But they realized they couldn't do any better than Dan, and they called him. You called him to be a minister among you. He hadn't had a moment's experience except what you had given him, but he dug right in, and the youth loved him. And he served here for several years until God stirred again in his heart, and he found himself called to First Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he still serves. And that created an opening. And this time you had learned that youth is an amazing thing, and that excitement comes from inexperience sometimes, and you didn't need to be looking for somebody who knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And you called the Reverend Dana Allen Walsh, fresh out of Princeton Theological Seminary. And Dana was green as grass and talented, and you dove in, and she dove in, and she loved the youth, and you began to love her too. And she had only been here a few years when Wendy Vanderhart, who is the Associate Conference Minister working with the Metropolitan Boston Association, called Dana and said, I need a favor. There's a church up the road, up Route 2 to the west. I got that right? Yeah. To the west. The Acton Congregational Church, they have a search committee, and they're looking for a new senior minister, and they found a candidate that they like, but they need to hear him preach. Can you open the pulpit of Hancock Church for him to preach and to host their committee? She said, sure, bring it on. And so the Reverend Andy Armstrong came and preached his neutral pulpit here, and he pleased the search committee, and they pleased him, and they called Andy to be the new senior minister of the Acton Congregational Church. 2 years later, Hancock Church still had Dana, but now was in need of calling a new senior minister themselves. And the search committee called Wendy and said, we have a candidate that we really want, but we'd like to hear him preach. Can you arrange that? So Wendy called who? The Acton Congregational Church, and said, can you return the favor? Hancock needs a place to hear a neutral pulpit. And they said, sure, bring it on. So on a snowy morning in the winter of 2009, Paul Schaefer picked me up at the Aloft Hotel where the search committee had put me up. And we drove together out Route 2 to Acton Congregational Church, where I preached for that good congregation and for members of the search committee. And Andy Armstrong welcomed me with open arms. It all seemed to go real well, and that summer I was called to be the senior minister here. And Wendy Vanderhart called me immediately and said, it'd be really good if you joined a clergy community of practice group. And these are small groups of clergy who meet regularly to provide mutual support and serve as confidants to one another. And I said, sure, that's great. And I show up at the first meeting, and you know who's there? Dan Smith and Andy Armstrong. And that group still meets to this day, and Dan and Andy are irreplaceable pillars for me. So I start to work here, and we keep calling these talented students. Hancock had been having student ministers for 40 years before I got here. But we kept calling these people, and you'll remember some of the names: Brian Groon, Becca Lockwood, Joy Fallon. Remember some of those good folk? Okay, and they kept coming, and we learned, and then I got a call from Wendy. And Wendy said, there's this church up the road to the north, South Church in Andover, and they've got a search committee together. They're looking for a new senior minister, and they're ready to start interviewing, but they need a dry run. Would you be willing to go up there and do a mock interview with them? And I said, sure. So she sends me their profile, and I read it carefully, and we go up, and I walk into their search committee meeting, and there's what looked like a fairly typical UCC church search committee to me, except they had a really young person on there, a young man with long hair who was a pedal cab driver in Boston. Okay, we have the interview, and it all went well. And at the end, they said to me, now, do you know anybody? And I mumbled something non-committal. And the next morning, I walked into Dana's office feeling like I was about to cut off my right arm. And I put that profile on her desk. And I said, they don't know it yet, but they're looking for you. And she read that profile, and she realized, yep, they were going to look for her. And she felt good about that. And she interviewed and was called there, right? Now, that means we've lost our associate minister. We need to do something, right? I called Wendy. I said, what are we supposed to do? And Wendy said, well, I think you probably already have the answer in-house. I said, oh, right. Our student. Remember Alex Shea-Will? Alex had been with us for about 3 years at that point. Pam Cochran, remember Pam? She'd been with us for about 4 years at that point. we took those students and we made them full-time, and they served in that year's interim while we searched for what turned out to be the Reverend Barbara Callahan, who came to us in part precisely because she was excited about the possibility of working with students and thought she had gifts to give to them. Well, the minute we find Barbara, that means Pam and Alex are free, and Pam finds herself called to the UCC church in Danvers, at Maple Street in Danvers, and Alex Will finds himself called to South Church Andover to work with Dana Ellen Walsh. Now, about the same time, we're upping the ante here. We're creating a cooperative MDiv, Master of Divinity program in cooperation with Andover Newton Theological School, where we're going to take students and we're really going to throw them into the deep end of ministry here at Hancock. We're going to give them significant responsibility to learn and grow. And do you know who the first and best candidate was that we interviewed for this program? It's that long-haired pedicabber from the search committee in Andover, whose name turned out to be Andrew Harris. And Andrew's with us a year, and then we add another position, and this guy, David Clark, shows up, and he turns out to be a pretty good candidate. Yes, right? All right. And in the meantime, we keep needing help with our congregational care positions, and we keep graduating students into that. Joy Fallon had done it first, and then Nancy Rotman stepped into that role, and then Amelia Attridge had come to teach Sunday school and ended up doing that role, and now Susan Klinkenbeard has stepped in and become that, and all this is going on. And then last Sunday, we get a call to go to Andover, where Andrew Harris is going to be ordained to Christian ministry in the United Church of Christ, because he's been called to a congregation where? Acton. Now, I know, some people would say, a lot of coincidences there. And other people would say, well, the UCC in New England is a little small village, and there are bound to be some things crossing. If you give enough chimps, enough typewriters, sooner or later one of them will write War and Peace, right? You've heard that? You can put yourself through those contortions if you want, or you can say to yourself what you know to be true, that our God is a God of deep purposefulness. And that God is constantly nudging God's people in particular directions for particular reasons. Now, that's a lot easier, isn't it? Just to acknowledge that, just to say that God is good. And God has desires for God's church. And that God puts the right people in the right places at the right time. And that God continues to call our congregation to this ministry of preparing students for ministry. Now, I offer this sermon for obvious reasons. Andrew last week, Amelia this afternoon. Our student ministers are very much in our mind. But also because we live in a world where there doesn't seem to be a lot of deep purpose at the moment. We seem to be tearing ourselves up over partisan things. We don't seem to be terribly good at listening to one another. And we can say, if we choose to, how do we sing? How do we sing the songs of God in a time like this? How do we sing about God and what God is doing in our world? We can do that. Or we can say, well, but we have seen with our own eyes how God continuously stirs among God's people and calls new things into being and creates connections where there had not been previously, and where the connections are built now, relationships are strong and common shared ministries are possible. And we can stand up and say, we believe in a God of deep purposefulness. And that our God is not interested in our tearing ourselves apart, but in building a new heaven and a new earth here and now, in which justice prevails for all God's people, in which all God's people are loved without exception. A world in which we are called to find our particular place to be of service. That's how we'll sing our song. That's how we'll sing a new song in this time and place. And we'll sing of God's goodness, and we'll sing of God's purpose. And because God is a God of purposefulness, how can we stop from singing? Thanks be to God. Amen.